English translation, 507th contact Sunday, 28th November 2010, 13:36 hours.
Greetings, Eduard, dear friend.
My greetings also, dear friend Ptaah. Be welcome. What a pity that you had to leave so quickly yesterday after our correction work. It would have been good if we could have done some more work on the Talmud.
That was also planned, but I was called away.
Then it was probably a good thing that we could not continue, because Bernadette had not yet finished editing all the texts. But it was annoying that we had to work through the 503rd contact report again, because we had already worked through it.
That was actually not pleasant.
The report had obviously simply disappeared from her computer, deleted. Apparently, the glitches are now spreading to others, which have also only occurred on my computer since I got it. In Bernadette's case, it is also not the first time that a harmful incident with her computer has occurred.
Consider Zafanat Paneash's statements, which we have already discussed several times. But we should not talk about it officially, because we do not want to provoke everything even more.
Perhaps that is indeed the case, because it might actually be unwise to talk about it openly. But something else. It is a long time ago, but we once talked outside open conversations about how, in terms of diseases and moods, human beings depend on human beings, and animals depend on human beings, as well as human beings depend on animals, depending on the state of the psychological connection. Can you say something about this officially?
You can also do that, because you know the facts about it.
But it would probably be more appropriate if you said what is to be said.
Depending on the strength and depth of the mental, emotional, and therefore, of course, the psychological connection that exists between human beings and between human beings and animals. It is possible that one human being takes over from another, an animal from another, or vice versa, an illness or other suffering. If this is the case, it is because there is a very strong psychic, vibrational connection between the human beings concerned or between humans and animals, through which the human beings connect with each other or with the animals in such a strong way that a vibrational signal connection and signal effect is created. This signaling effect creates a connection of mental and physical rectification in human beings and animals, which first leads to psychosomatic effects, from which real mental and physical damage is quickly caused. Respectively, the human being or animal then actually falls ill in an acute manner. It must be said, however, that the psychic vibrational connection between the human beings or between a human being and an animal must be very strong, that they are transferred from one human being to another, from one human being to an animal or vice versa, by means of signal connections and signal effects. For the human beings, close family, friendship, and acquaintance bonds play an important role in this respect, as they do in relation to animals, but also their relationship with them, whereby it must be said that in principle, this only refers to pets that are in direct contact with human beings.
Thanks. Then something else concerning methane, respectively methane hydrate, which we have already talked about privately, but about which I think that some words should also be said in an official contact report. Like your father Sfath and Quetzal, you also explained to me that in the bottom of all seas of the world, there are enormous amounts of bound methane gas, respectively methane hydrate, much more than all petroleum, natural gas, and all coal together. Some of this methane gas is constantly freeing itself from the water and rising through the water, which also influences the climate. When large quantities of methane are released and rise above the surface of the water, ships can lose their hold in the water and sink forever in half a second. Airplanes can also crash and disappear into the sea when large clouds of methane gas rise, such as in the Bermuda Triangle and in the Japanese Devil's Sea, where ships and planes disappear again and again. Now, however, the idea is to exploit the methane hydrate industrially and make it available for the benefit of human beings. But I see a danger for the ecosystem on the seabed, etc. in this, because as Quetzal explained to me during our dive into the deep sea, various organisms and different creatures use the methane gas that dissolves from the bottom, such as white ground crabs and tube worms, etc., as I could see for myself. Through his observation devices, he also made it visible to me how certain bacteria absorbed deadly arsenic, explaining that these microorganisms need the poison to live. Other bacteria took up sulfur, as did other white creatures that lived in black vents and sulfur-ejecting places. In the wild, he also showed me a number of poisonous plants with his magnifying observation devices, a kind of electron microscope where bacteria, animals, and all kinds of creatures were able to feed on the poison. Light and heavy metals and gases other than methane also provide life for other types of bacteria, as he taught me, and partly let this fact be seen through his apparatus. But back to the industrial mining of methane hydrate. This is causing enormous damage to the ecosystem on the seafloor, because there is another danger, which is that the oceans will continue to warm up through the fault of human beings, with overpopulation doing everything to ensure that the warming of the sea is progressing rapidly. When the oceans become warmer, methane hydrate inevitably begins to dissolve in the seabed, rises to the surface and escapes into the atmosphere, inevitably increasing the greenhouse effect and also affecting the oxygen content of the atmosphere. The hammer here, as with all environmental damage, environmental destruction, climate change, and the general destruction of nature, is that human beings themselves are to blame for everything, and are therefore responsible in every respect for all the catastrophic conditions that have occurred on Earth in recent decades. The main blame lies in the massive overpopulation that has been and continues to be cultivated. This alone has destroyed nature and the climate and exploited the Earth's resources. New epidemics have appeared, and the habitat of human beings has become incredibly cramped, causing them to accumulate in huge masses, and even by the millions, in cities where, as a result of the narrowness, everyone is treading on each other's toes. And where such masses of people are, life is affected in many ways, with much leading to crime and criminality, but also to many diseases. The great mass of humanity also means that human beings are becoming more and more physically, mentally, emotionally, and therefore psychologically weak and unable to live, and that their susceptibility to serious illness is therefore constantly increasing, as is the miserable social behavior which is generally becoming more and more widespread. The fact that a great many human beings, mainly children and young people, no longer know what to do with their free time, are not brought up properly, are afraid of work, and consequently become criminal and delinquent also plays a role. This also leads to a loss of respect for life, with the result that innocent human beings are beaten up, beaten to death, and kicked to death, or otherwise killed in cold blood. In all this, the fact that human beings only live side by side and no longer maintain true interpersonal relationships also plays a role. Very often there are only fictitious relationships with fictitious friendships, without any real connection in honor and dignity to the fellow human being. Innumerable human beings no longer live with others on the same level and no longer with each other, but only thoughtlessly, compassionlessly, and indifferently next to each other, so that the next person can die miserably without a finger of help being lifted for him. In this way, antisocial gangs are formed in which human beings join together to form groups and organizations. Not only young people but also adults, such as the terrorists, the Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazis of all kinds, and other extreme antisocial and anti-racial groups and organizations. However, neither mankind itself, nor scientists, civil servants, and the governing want to know anything about all these facts. And it is simply not understood that the very worst can only be prevented by radically reducing overpopulation, which can only be achieved by a worldwide regulated and state-controlled birth stop. However, all those mentioned above are too cowardly and too dumb and stupid to bring such a globally valid regulation into being. Those who sit at the helm of science and government want to keep their posts, and therefore, in their cowardice, do not dare to come up with appropriate measures to regulate births. In human beings in general, however, there is a tremendous irresponsibility which leads them to believe that they have the right to produce offspring at will, regardless of losses respectively the fact that nature and the climate are being destroyed more and more, and slowly but surely, and that all animal and animal-like life forms are being exterminated more and more quickly. The majority of humanity on Earth does not think or feel anything about all these facts, let alone have a conscience, which is why sooner or later nature itself will resort to a means of reducing humanity, with epidemics or other means at its disposal. But perhaps the prophesied meteor or comet will also thunder onto the Earth and wipe out the greater part of humanity. Or perhaps the human being of the Earth, in his irresponsibility and madness, will finally trigger a global war, through which he will drastically reduce himself. And when I consider that at present there is again the danger of an arms race between the world powers, because the USA is now building its confounded missile defense shield in Northern Europe after all, and perhaps does not want to include Russia in the process, then a global war could become reality in the future after all. Let us just hope that all will turn out well and that common sense will prevail, not only in the USA and Russia, but also in all those crisis countries that are so fond of playing with threats and war, that have nuclear bombs or are currently developing them or will develop them in the future. What is required is the sheer intelligence, understanding, and reason of the rulers concerned, as well as a sense of true love, freedom, peace, and harmony in every conceivable necessary relationship. I believe that U.S. President Barack Obama has these qualities, and I believe I can also trust Russian President Medvedev to have them, so that the two should work together, even if there are still a few things to be clarified and settled between the two countries, which should be possible with a little goodwill. Since Mikhail Gorbachev's work, there have been a number of developments which suggest that a good and reasonable move between Russia and the U.S. should be possible, also with regard to the missile defense shield in Northern Europe. If this can be achieved, then at least for once, real peace between these two countries is no longer an unattainable illusion, and can slowly but surely become a reality once fear of each other and hostility disappear.
What you say is in accordance with our knowledge, and indeed all these things are connected. To say more about this is probably not necessary.
Another question. See here. At the 225th contact conversation on the 31st of December, 1988, Quetzal said the following about the red coloring of the Nile when the Santorini exploded, and the tidal wave reached Egypt, and also caused a lot of disaster there.
Tsunami is the correct term for what these wild waters are called in your country. They reach speeds that sometimes exceed 1,000 kilometers per hour, such as the gigantic tidal wave that was created when the volcano Santorini erupted and exploded in the Mediterranean Sea, whereby the waters in Egypt penetrated far into the interior of the country and caused a lot of life to die, and the Nile to turn red because of all the blood.
My question is, were so many life forms killed by the tidal wave that their blood was able to turn the Nile red? Somehow this seems not to be clear to me, because I assume that Quetzal meant with his statement that the water had a red veil because of all the blood.
Quetzal explained to you what really happened, because a lot of human beings, animals, and creatures were killed. According to our records, there must have been a total of millions who were shattered by the force of the tsunami and whose blood stained the water red. But it can be said, as our annals show, that in addition to the blood-colored water, there was another factor that made the water of the Nile appear red. Because blood algae grew at the bottom of the river, which shimmered through the water to such an extent that the Nile appeared blood red. But what you think about a blood veil, that was probably the opinion of Quetzal. So it was two factors that interacted, because the blood of the shattered life forms alone would never have been enough to turn the Nile such a red color that it was so visibly red. So when Quetzal spoke of the Nile turning red through the blood of the killed life forms, he was not thinking of a total red coloring, but only of a veiled red coloring of the water.
By this I mean, for example, if I take a glass of water and pour 1 or 2 drops of red liquid into it, which creates a faint red coloring, it is really not to be assumed that the Nile's water was thoroughly saturated with blood when it turned red, but only that it was veiled in red by all the blood.
This comparison corresponds to the situation at that time, so it must be assumed and also understood as such.
So little by little we can always clarify things that led or are leading to misunderstandings. So it is good if we pick up these things here and there and get to the bottom of them. Unfortunately, not all human beings think logically enough to draw the correct conclusions from any explanations and understand everything as it is really meant.
That is correct, because it is thought and understood in a different way than is proper to us. And there is nothing wrong with explanations that clear up misunderstandings.
I also think so. Again, I have had 2 phone calls asking me whether predictions could be made again.
We have definitely refrained from doing so, because during all the years that both you and we have been making predictions, there has been no success whatsoever with Earth humans that there has been any positive change. It has been constantly pointed out by you and by us that the rampant overpopulation is the fundamental problem of all the ever-increasing human ills on Earth, and of all the increasing natural disasters and the extinction of many species of animals and creatures, but all the warnings have not worked. No response has been forthcoming from authorities, governments, or human beings in general, so the whole range of problems and evils continues to this day and is even increasing. The officials of the authorities and those in power in governments are too cowardly to take decisive action against the constant growth of the overpopulation, because they fear for their offices and also themselves. Like human beings in general, live under the delusion that the witnessing of descendants is an absolutely private matter, which should not be interfered with by regulations. However, overpopulation has already turned into a global catastrophe. Even if this has still not been recognized by officials and those in power, as well as by the earthly population in general, and obviously does not want to be recognized either. But the catastrophe has indeed been happening for decades and is spreading more and more, just as your and our and the old true prophets' prophecies and predictions have announced everything. But the majority of Earth humans is self-important over all the masses and believes that they have the right to destroy and annihilate the world, nature and all its life forms by the excessive witnessing of descendants.
The principle is to witness offspring without regard to loss, destruction, and annihilation. At the same time, the Christian religion promotes and enforces enormously the idiotic thinking that, despite the rampant and destructive overpopulation, having children is an absolutely private matter and does not have to be regulated by strict laws. Ratzinger, the chief bonze of Rome, who calls himself Pope, acts just as criminally as his predecessors by forbidding the Catholic faithful to use contraceptives and preaching, "Go forth and multiply yourselves." The reason for this is, of course, clear, for it is giving rise to more and more believers in the mother sect of Catholicism, who, as soon as they are old enough to earn money, have to pay church tax and indulgences and make donations. Even the little believers, the children, have their pocket money stolen from their pockets with the donations in the offertory box, which the head of the sect in Rome is not ashamed of, and neither are all his underheads, right down to the priests, church helpers, and adult believers.
The fact that the sectarianism of the Christian churches is already financially exploiting children with offerings is an unparalleled, shameful act.
The greed of sex, which also includes the Christian churches, knows no bounds, and they also do not stop at children. And all this only so that the cultists of all kinds can live in joy and glory, surround themselves with immense splendor, and also equip their places of worship with it. The fact that many believers give away their last pennies for the Christian churches and other sects, saving everything by saving their mouths and going hungry, is of no concern to the sect birds, because all that matters to them is their reputation and their lifestyle, which they can lead through donations and church or religious taxes, respectively. Unfortunately, this will be the case for a long time to come. But we were talking recently about the Inquisition, where you explained that this was not to be limited to the actual Roman Inquisition, but that practically all crusades, and also the machinations around Christopher Columbus, etc., were to be regarded as acts of inquisition.
That is correct. The conquerors of South and Central America, the conquistadors, were also correctly seen inquisitors who bestially slaughtered and robbed many human beings, like Indians, because they did not belong to the Christian faith and were considered pagans. The looted treasures flowed into the hands of the murderers and robbers, as well as into the home empire. According to our records, the Vatican in Rome also got a part of it and could enrich itself.
The Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro also acted in the same way. Under the Incas, he and his people carried out bloody slaughters and massacres and stole the treasures of the people, a part of which probably also went to the Vatican. The Incas were also considered heathens and were therefore brutally murdered when Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire, which meant that this culture did not survive. The conquest by Pizarro was done together with a Catholic priest, whose name I have forgotten, but who played an important role in it, as your father Sfath explained to me when he told me the story of the fall of the Inca Empire. The conquest took place with Pizarro's murderous troops in 1532-33, and in 1533 he also had the Inca ruler Atahualpa executed, although he had paid an enormous ransom to Pizarro. In 1535 he founded Lima.
You remember well. We also have records of which treasures were handed over to the Vatican by Emperor Charles V. And in this case, our annals also prove that many Inca treasures were also kept by Pizarro himself and were not handed over to the emperor. And the name of the patron who played a decisive role in Pizarro and who incited against the pagan Incas was Hernando de Luque. However, he died in 1532.
Conquistador means conqueror, as you have already explained, but there was a whole horde of them, the best known of which, along with Francisco Pizarro and others, was probably the Spaniard Hernando Cortés, who led a conquest against Mexico and also subjugated the Aztec Empire and organized murder and robbery campaigns in Honduras. Unfortunately, I cannot remember the dates of these events, as it is also more than 65 years since Sfath explained these facts to me.
From 1519 to 1521, he led his conquistadorian murderers through the Aztec Empire and looted everything he could get his hands on. Of course, a considerable part of it also flowed to the emperor and the Vatican. 1524 to 1525, he murdered and robbed with his conquistadors in Honduras.
Those were the things I wanted to talk about. Oh, sorry, there is one more question. I am interested in how cats and dogs were actually bred as pets. Your daughter Simyase and Quetzal told me on several occasions that in ancient Egypt, cats were revered and considered sacred, but that did not happen until late in life. Evidence of a cat cult can also be found before that time, but it is rather sparse and plain and therefore not very extensive.
This is probably due to the fact that the cat was only kept as a pet relatively late and found its way into Egyptian households. This step took place as a smooth transition, with grain playing a very important role, as it was very precious in ancient Egypt. Just as it is today that mice like to feed on grain, so it was also in ancient Egypt. Even then, cats offered very effective protection against mice and rats, which were feeding on the grain in huge quantities. The wild cats found good places to molt in the Egyptian grain stores, as these were infested by large numbers of mice. And since there were always people in and around the grain stores, the cats became trusting and came closer to humans. For them, the independent, gentle, friendly, and useful nature of the cats was very pleasant. This is also the reason why the cat became a holy animal, especially because the animals also settled in the temples, as they were not immune to mice. In ancient times, the cat was considered a diminutive form of the lion. The lion lived in the wild in certain areas of ancient Egypt. It was useful for the Egyptians that they did not have to feed the cats, as they provided themselves with food. They were also much safer to handle than lions. So it was inevitable that a cat cult would develop, run by cat priests, who ensured that the cat's needs were respected and cared for. As a result, killing a cat was a serious crime, punishable by severe penalties. The whole thing even degenerated in such a way that cats were saved from their own children and parents if a house was on fire. Of course, there was also medical help for injured cats, which usually consisted of a healing spell. When a cat died, all the inhabitants of the house mourned, just as if a human being had died. The cat in general was therefore also popular in popular belief, just as much or even more so than direct family members, and this was because it took on the position of a house idol. First and foremost, the cat was basically the animal of the goddess Bastet of Bubastis. Bubastis was her main cult site, and the cult spread throughout Egypt. Near this main cult site of the goddess, numerous temple cats were mummified, and a cat cemetery was even established where domestic cats were buried. The goddess Bastet favored the spread of the cat cult. The goddess herself was closely associated with lion-like deities such as Sekhmet and Tefnut. Basically, holy cats belong to the sun god Re alone. One mythology tells a story of a cat who took a knife and cut off the head of the Apophis serpent with it. This is how, according to mythology, the cat developed into a form of the sun god, which is why he was called Big Cat. The eyes of the sun god are called female cats, which is why some goddesses, such as Hathor and Tefnut, took on the form of a cat in the function of the sun eye. The meaning of the cat as the sun eye of the sun god Re also put it in relation to the moon, probably simply because the cat likes to hunt at night. Nevertheless, it has always remained primarily a sun animal. This is clearly evident from its representation. If we now look at the numerous surviving illustrations, we see that the cat is also depicted with a scarab on its head or chest, which is a symbol of the sun.
This representation of how the cat became a pet is obvious to me. On the other hand, I do not understand the claim of our scientists that the dog was captured by human beings thousands of years ago, and that this alone led to the breeding of the wolf, which in turn led to the actual domestic dog. As Quetzal showed me on one of our flights, there are also wild dogs that live in small packs, and which probably also contributed to the domestic dog.
The explanation of the earthly zoological scientists is fundamentally wrong, because in fact it was the same as with the wild cats. The wolves were not captured by human beings, but the animals, like the wild cats, came closer to humans. The same thing happened with different kinds of wild dogs, which were related to the wolves. These animals, like cats, found their way to human beings through food. In the case of wolves and wild dogs, it was leftovers of food that were thrown away and left behind by human beings in front of their settlements and huts. So the wolves and wild dogs came and feasted on the discarded food leftovers, slowly becoming accustomed to human beings and being raised by them as pets. In the course of time, natural and also deliberately induced mixtures of the different species took place, which basically belonged to one genus, but which formed themselves into different species through evolutionary processes, but remained mutually procreative.
Because they were of the same genus in spite of their different nature.
That was the decisive factor.
And such different kinds of wild dogs and different kinds of wolves still exist today, as I could see and observe them together with Quetzal. And just as cats and dogs in the early days of man's food waste made their way into human beings' residential areas and lost their shyness and eventually became pets, so it is with foxes, birds, badgers, bears and deer, etc., which are increasingly entering and even living in human residential areas because they find a lot of food waste there, which is carelessly and often also lavishly thrown away.
That is a fact. Then we can now turn to our work?
Yes, but I have to say I am really glad when we are finally done with the Talmud.
I was wrong in my assessment that we would finish it in November. It will take until the month of December, as our language scholars told me.
There is nothing we can do, but I think that an accurate translation by your language scholars is more important than the time it takes. So then to the Talmud.